8 people, thousands of animals. A wooden box sealed with pitch floating over a shoreless ocean, and a question that almost no one asks. What did all those people eat? Because it is easy to look at Noah's Ark and think of the flood, the waves, and the 40 days of rain. But the rain was only the beginning. The biblical text in Genesis 7 and 8 makes it clear that Noah, his family, and all those animals were locked inside that structure for approximately 370 days, more than a year, and during that entire time, every creature on board needed to eat, every single day. No crops, no hunting, no market, no dry land, only what was already inside before the door was closed. Now, do the math with me. We are talking about something between 6,700 and 16,000 animals, depending on how you interpret species and kind in the original text, each with a different diet. Herbivores that need tons of grass, carnivores that need fresh meat, rodents that eat grains, birds that eat seeds, fruits and insects, reptiles that eat eggs, small prey, or simply nothing for weeks. And in the middle of all this, 8 human beings who also needed to feed themselves, and who, on top of that, were responsible for feeding everyone else. The question is not whether God could perform a miracle and multiply food inside the ark. The question is, the biblical text does not describe that. Genesis is direct. God says to Noah, "Take for yourself every kind of food that is eaten and gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them." The order is clear. God did not say, "I will feed the animals." He said, "You will take food and store it." This means logistics, planning, storage, preservation, distribution, and that is exactly what makes this story so fascinating. Because when you start calculating the volume of food necessary to sustain thousands of living creatures for over a year inside a structure 140 meters long by 23 meters wide and 13.5 meters high, 3 floors divided into compartments, you realize that the Ark was not a passive miracle. It was a survival operation on an industrial scale. And the first question that needs to be answered before any other is exactly how much food needed to be on board. John Woodmore-Rapp, a researcher who published one of the most detailed studies on the viability of the Ark, calculated that the total number of animals on board could be reduced to something around 16,000 individuals if we consider biblical kinds, what taxonomists call the family or genus level, not species. This changes everything. Because instead of taking 400 breeds of dogs, you take a pair of the canid kind. Instead of 200 species of cats, a pair of the feline kind. The biblical concept of kind, in Hebrew min, is broader than modern classification, and this drastically reduces the number of mouths to feed. But even with 16,000 animals, the volume of food required is staggering. Let's make a conservative estimate. Most animals on board were not large. About 80% were the size of a rabbit or smaller. Rats, small birds, lizards, frogs, larger insects. This is a crucial detail, because when we think of the Ark, we think of elephants, giraffes, rhinoceroses, the giants, but they were the absolute minority. Most passengers could fit in the palm of your hand. Even so, when you add it all up, from the smallest to the largest, Woodmore-Rapp estimated that the total amount of food needed for 371 days would be around 1,500 to 2,000 tons. It sounds absurd, but put it into perspective. The Ark had an estimated internal volume of approximately 43,000 cubic meters. That is the equivalent of more than 500 freight train cars. Of this total space, the animals would occupy between 30% and 45%, depending on the size of the compartments. Food and water could occupy another 25% to 35%, and there would still be room for humans, access corridors, ventilation, and work areas. The math adds up. It is tight, but it adds up. Now, the next question is much more interesting than how much, it is what. Because storing 2,000 tons of food is useless if that food rots by the second month. Think about the problem. You are inside a closed wooden box. The humidity is constant. You are literally floating on water. The temperature varies with the external climate. There is no refrigeration, no vacuum sealing, no modern chemical preservatives, and you need tons of food to last more than 12 months without spoiling. If you put fresh fruits, vegetables, and raw meat in that ark, in 2 weeks you would have a biological disaster. Fungi, bacteria, decomposition, insects. The food would turn into poison before the flood dried up a single drop. So, what did Noah take? The answer lies in the preservation techniques that the ancient world had already mastered millennia before any refrigerator existed. And here is something many people do not realize. Pre-Diluvian humanity, according to the biblical account, was not primitive. Genesis 4 describes metallurgy. Tubal-Cain worked with bronze and iron. It describes music. Jubal invented instruments. It describes organized livestock. Jabal raised cattle. It describes cities. Cain built the first one. We are talking about a civilization with at least 1,600 years of accumulated technological development before the flood. Noah was not a caveman improvising. He had access to sophisticated agricultural knowledge, and the techniques he almost certainly used are the same ones that fed entire civilizations for millennia after him. First and most obvious, dry grains, wheat, barley, oats, corn. Dehydrated grains are the perfect survival food. When stored in sealed containers and kept dry, they last for years, literally years. Archaeologists have found wheat grains in Egyptian tombs over 3,000 years old that were still in a condition to germinate. A study by the University of Cambridge confirmed that barley seeds found in archaeological contexts in the Fertile Crescent maintained their integrity for centuries when protected from moisture. For herbivores, who made up the overwhelming majority of animals on board, dry grains were the perfect base. Mixed with dry hay and compressed straw, they provided enough carbohydrates, fiber, and nutrients to keep medium and large animals alive and functional for months. And here enters an engineering detail that is brilliant in its simplicity: compressed hay. If you take fresh grass, it occupies an enormous volume and rots in days. But if you dry that grass in the sun and compact it into bales, exactly as farmers do to this day, it reduces to 1/5 of its original volume and can last more than 2 years without losing significant nutritional value. A standard bale of hay weighs about 20 kilos and feeds a sheep for almost a week. Now imagine hundreds of bales stacked from floor to ceiling on the lower floors of the ark, organized by section, accessible by internal corridors. It is not fiction. It is basic agricultural logistics that existed in the ancient world. But grains and hay solve the problem for herbivores. What about the others? Those who eat meat? This is where most people get stuck, because the question seems impossible. How do you feed predators without hunting, without live prey, without fresh meat? 3 answers. The first is the simplest and the most ignored. Most carnivores do not need fresh meat to survive. Many canids, ursids, and even smaller felines can survive on mixed diets: grains, dried fruits, roots, dehydrated fish. Wolves in captivity today are fed cereal-based kibble and processed protein. Bears are omnivores and eat practically anything. The idea that every predator needs a bleeding steak every day is a myth. Most survive and even thrive on alternatives. The second answer: dried meat and dehydrated fish, jerky, shark, salted fish. These are ancestral preservation techniques. You cut the meat into thin strips, salt it generously, and dry it in the sun or wind. The result is a protein that lasts for months without refrigeration. Peoples of the Middle East, Africa, and Asia used this technique millennia before Christ, and salt, crucial for preservation, was abundant in the region of the ancient Near East, especially near the Dead Sea, where natural rock salt deposits exist to this day. The third answer is the most ingenious: insects. Before you turn up your nose, understand one thing. Insects are the most efficient protein source on the planet. Crickets, mealworms, locusts, they reproduce at absurd speeds, occupy minimal space, consume almost nothing, and provide very high-quality protein. A colony of mealworms can multiply from a few hundred to tens of thousands in weeks, feeding only on grain bran and vegetable peels. If you agree that all this logistics inside the Ark is impressive, comment, God planned everything. Now imagine this inside the Ark. Ceramic or wooden containers with self-reproducing insect colonies. Live, fresh, renewable food for insectivorous birds, for lizards, for small mammals. It was the perfect system. A microscopic protein farm inside a floating farm. And the most incredible part, this system required almost no extra work. The insects did all the work themselves. All that was needed was to keep the substrate moist and add vegetable scraps. It is at this point that you begin to realize something. The Ark was not an improvised warehouse. It was a designed ecosystem. Each solution fed the next. The herbivores ate grains and hay. The scraps and husks of the grains fed insect colonies. The insects fed birds and reptiles. The animal waste, and we will talk about waste in detail later, could be composted and used to maintain fertile substrates for insect colonies and even for sprouted shoots. It was a cycle, closed, functional. And this leads us to the next problem that seems impossible, but has a solution so elegant it will change the way you see this entire vessel. Because dry food solves a lot, but it does not solve everything. Some animals need fresh food, vitamins that degrade in dry grains, nutrients that only exist in living vegetables. And this is where a technique comes in that modern humanity only rediscovered in the 20th century, but that probably already existed on board that Ark. Germination, sprouts, green forage grown on board. If you take a handful of barley, wheat or lentil grains, moisten them slightly, and leave them in a shallow container with a damp cloth on top, in 3 to 7 days you have green sprouts. Living forage, vitamin C, vitamin A, enzymes, fresh fiber, all this from dry grains that occupied a fraction of the space. This is not modern speculation. The technique of germinating grains is documented in ancient civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Egyptians germinated barley as part of the beer-making process, and this process appears in records from over 4,000 years ago. The idea that wet grains sprout is so basic and observable that any agricultural civilization would discover it naturally. Now imagine germination trays stacked on shelves in the middle floors of the Ark. Layers and layers of sprouts growing in cycles. While one batch is harvested and distributed to the animals, another is germinating. A rotating system that transforms dry stock into fresh food continuously. Without soil, without direct sun, sprouts germinate in the dark, with almost no water waste, because the amount needed is minimal. And this is exactly the kind of solution that makes the Ark stop looking like a fairy tale and start looking like a survival engineering project. Because every problem that seems impossible, feeding thousands of animals, preserving food for a year, providing fresh nutrients without agriculture, has a real, physical, verifiable answer. It does not require a miracle. It requires intelligence. But feeding the animals is only half of the equation. The other half, the one almost no one thinks about, is water, because an animal can survive days, sometimes weeks, without food. But without water, depending on the size, between 24 and 72 hours. And we are talking about thousands of thirsty creatures every day, for 370 days. So how do you quench the thirst of an entire zoo surrounded by saltwater and rainwater contaminated by a global cataclysm? The irony is brutal. The Ark was floating on more water than any structure in history, a planetary ocean that covered everything, and not a single drop of that water was fit for drinking. If the flood mixed oceanic waters with continental waters, and everything indicates it did, given that the text describes the fountains of the great deep breaking open along with the floodgates of heaven, then the water around the Ark was a brackish mixture, loaded with sediment, decomposing organic matter and salt. Toxic, useless. Therefore, the drinking water had to be on board before the door was closed, or it needed to be collected and treated during the journey. And here, both possibilities make sense. The first, internal reservoirs. With a total volume of 43,000 cubic meters, the Ark had space for massive cisterns. Wood lined with pitch, bitumen, is waterproof. It is exactly the material used to build cisterns in the ancient world. The Mesopotamians built water storage tanks using wood and bitumen centuries before Abraham was born. A reservoir 10 meters by 5 by 3, the size of a large room, holds 150,000 liters of water. A few of these in the hold of the Ark, and you already have a significant reserve. The second possibility is even smarter, rainwater collection. During the first 40 days, torrential rain fell non-stop. After the 40 days, the text does not say the rain stopped completely. It says the fountains of the deep and the floodgates of heaven were closed, and that the waters began to recede gradually. This suggests that lighter rains may have continued for months. The Ark had a ventilation opening that Zohar described in Genesis that circumvented the top of the structure. This opening, protected by some kind of sloped cover to prevent waves from entering, was the primary ventilation system. But it would also be a natural rainwater collector. Water running down the roof, channeled by wooden gutters to internal reservoirs, filtered through layers of sand and charcoal, another purification technique that the ancient world knew perfectly. If this surprises you, know that archaeologists have found water filtration systems with sand and gravel in city ruins from the 3rd millennium BC. It is not modern technology. It is ancient engineering functioning within a project that most people treat as a children's story, with little animals entering 2 by 2. Now let's look at the numbers, because without them we stay in the realm of imagination. The average water consumption of all animals on board, calculated based on consumption averages per kilogram of body mass, would be around 10,000 to 15,000 liters per day. It sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but a moderate rain over a catchment surface the size of the Ark's roof, approximately 3,200 square meters, would generate thousands of liters per hour. A heavy downpour could fill an entire reservoir in one night. And here enters another detail that almost no one considers. Not all animals drink the same amount of water. Reptiles and amphibians consume minimal amounts. Many insects and arachnids get all the hydration they need from their food. Small birds drink only a few milliliters per day. The large consumers, cattle, horses, elephants, were the minority on board. And even these could have their consumption reduced with moisture-rich diets, such as the sprouted shoots we already mentioned. If all this engineering of the Ark is impressing you, leave a like now. This helps this video reach more people who need to hear this story. But so far we have talked about food as if it were an abstract problem of numbers and logistics. Tons, liters, cubic meters. Let's change the perspective. Let's enter the Ark and feel what it was like to live inside, because the daily reality of feeding that population was something no calculation can fully convey. Imagine waking up before dawn, if you could even tell when it was dawn, because inside that structure natural light was minimal. The opening of the Zohar at the top let in a diffuse brightness, but on the lower floors it was almost total darkness. You light an oil lamp with extreme care because the concentration of methane from animal waste made any flame a real risk. The air is heavy, dense. It smells like damp hay, manure, animal sweat, and pitch-soaked wood. It is a smell that sticks to your clothes, your hair, your skin. After a few weeks, you don't even feel it anymore. It is part of you. You go down a wooden ladder to the second floor. The noise is constant. It is not silence as we imagine. It is a living cacophony. Low moose, bleats, chirps, distant growls, the scraping of hooves on wood, the flapping of wings in cages, hundreds of overlapping sounds that never stop, day and night, for 370 days. Your first task is to check the water reservoirs. You walk through a narrow corridor between wooden compartments. On one side, medium-sized ruminants chewing hay in the dark. On the other, rows of cages with birds that start to stir when they hear your footsteps. They know that footsteps mean food. They have already learned. You reach the main reservoir. You open the lid. The water is there, dark but clean. It was filtered yesterday by Shem and Japheth through the layers of sand and charcoal. You dip a bucket and begin the distribution. And here is the part that crushes any romanticism about the Ark: the routine. The brutal and inescapable repetition of doing the same thing every day without rest, without vacation, without an end in sight. Feeding, watering, cleaning waste, checking the sick, repairing compartments damaged by swaying of the sea, rotating grain stocks to prevent mold, harvesting sprouts, preparing new germination trays, treating injuries, separating animals that tried to attack each other through the partitions. 8 people doing all this, every day, for more than a year. The division of labor had to be surgical. Noah was 600 years old when the flood began, and even considering the longevity described in Genesis, he was not doing the heavy work alone. His 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their respective wives formed the team. 8 people to keep thousands of animals alive. The only way for this to work is with primitive automation, and that is exactly what researchers suggest. Sloped feeders that use gravity to distribute grains automatically. You fill the reservoir at the top, and the grain goes down to the trays as the animals consume it. Ceramic waterers with a rudimentary float system, a mechanism so simple it existed in ancient Egypt for irrigation. Sloped floors in animal compartments so that waste would flow by gravity to collection channels, drastically reducing cleaning time. None of this is science fiction technology. They are basic mechanical solutions that ancient civilizations used extensively. The question was never whether it was possible. It was whether someone would have the intelligence and discipline to implement it all on a scale never before attempted. But food and water were only the beginning of the logistical nightmare. Because everything that goes into an animal, every grain, every drop of water, every larva, eventually comes out the other side. And what came out was a problem so serious that without a solution, it would have killed everyone on board long before the waters receded. Waste. The word is clinical, almost harmless on paper. But the reality it represents inside the Ark was anything but harmless. Let's do the math that no one wants to do. An adult cow produces between 25 and 40 kilograms of manure per day. A horse, about 20. A sheep, 2 to 3 kilograms. A young elephant, and on board there were likely juveniles, not 6-ton adults, still produces more than 50 kilograms of feces and urine combined daily. Now multiply that by hundreds of species, thousands of individual animals for 370 consecutive days. The numbers are nauseating. Conservative estimates place the total waste production on board between 10 and 15 tons per day. Per day. That is the equivalent of filling a dump truck every few hours. If this material accumulated without control, 3 things would happen in sequence. and each would be lethal on its own. The first, toxic gases. Decomposing feces release ammonia, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. Ammonia, in concentrations above 50 parts per million, causes severe irritation to the eyes and respiratory system. Above 300 ppm, it can be fatal. In a closed environment like the Ark, without adequate ventilation, ammonia levels would reach dangerous concentrations in a matter of days, not weeks, days. Methane is odorless but flammable and asphyxiating, and hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg smell, is lethal in surprisingly low concentrations. In short, without waste management, the internal atmosphere of the Ark would become a gas chamber before the first month was over. The second consequence, diseases. Accumulated feces are the perfect breeding ground for pathogenic bacteria. Salmonella, E. coli, Clostridium. Organisms that cause hemorrhagic diarrhea, systemic infections, and death. In a confined space, with animals from hundreds of different species, each carrying its own microbiome, the risk of a zoonotic epidemic was astronomical. An uncontrolled outbreak would decimate entire animal populations in weeks. And the third, weight. 15 tons of waste per day that are not removed mean that in 1 month you have added 450 tons to the vessel's load. In 6 months, almost 3,000 extra tons. This would alter the waterline, compromise stability, and could literally sink the ship. So Noah faced a triple problem: lethal gases, disease, and excess weight. And all of it came from the same source, the waste that was produced incessantly, inevitably, 24 hours a day, without pause. What was the solution? Actually, it wasn't one solution. It was an integrated system with at least 4 components working simultaneously. The first, sloped floors with drainage channels. We mentioned this briefly, but it's worth going deeper. If the animal compartments had floors with a slight slope, somewhere between 3 and 5 degrees, enough for runoff but not for the animals to slip, the urine and the liquid part of the feces would flow naturally into side gutters. These gutters would lead the material to a central collection point on each floor, and from there to a reservoir on the bottom floor. Gravity doing the work. No pumps, no motors, no sophisticated technology, just wood cut at the right angle. And here is a detail that seems minor but changes everything. Absorbent bedding, dry straw, sawdust, grain husks, spread over the floor of the compartments in thick layers. This material absorbs moisture from solid waste, drastically reduces the smell of ammonia, and facilitates removal. Instead of scraping manure stuck to wet wood, a job that would take hours, you simply pick up the layer of dirty straw, replace it with clean straw, and the compartment is operational again in minutes. Farmers and horse breeders have been doing exactly this for thousands of years. Medieval European stables used this system. Roman stables used it, Mesopotamian stables used it. It is one of the oldest and most universal animal management techniques in human history. The second component, removal through side openings. The Ark did not just have one door and a window at the top. Genesis describes 3 floors, and it is reasonable to assume that each floor had some point of access to the outside, even if it were a sealable opening for specific cases. A side hatch at the lowest level, for example, could be opened briefly to dump collected waste directly into the water. Yes, directly into the ocean. Before you protest about marine pollution, remember, we are talking about a global ocean covering the entire planet, with billions of tons of organic matter already dissolved by the destruction of the entire terrestrial biosphere. The waste from a few thousand animals was a drop, literally in this ocean of destruction. The operation would be quick: open the hatch, dump, close. Done on the lower floors, near the waterline, the risk of flooding was minimal in relatively calm sea conditions. But not all waste needed to be discarded. And here enters the third component, the most brilliant: composting on board. Herbivore feces mixed with used straw and vegetable scraps form a compost that, when piled and slightly moist, decomposes through aerobic bacterial action. The process generates heat. Internal temperatures of a compost pile can exceed 60 degrees Celsius, which kills parasites and pathogens. The result, after a few weeks, is a stable, odorless, and nutrient-rich material. And this compost served as a substrate for the insect colonies that fed birds and reptiles. Closed cycle. The waste of one animal was transformed into food for another. No waste. The same logic that nature uses in any ecosystem: decomposition, recycling, reuse, functioning in miniature inside a floating wooden box. The fourth component was the most critical of all: ventilation. Without air circulation, none of the other systems worked. Gases would accumulate, the heat from composting would make certain floors unbearable, and moisture would condense on the walls and ceiling, creating a tropical greenhouse environment inside a vessel that could not have open windows during storms. The Tsoha, that opening described in Genesis, was the answer. And here most people make an error of interpretation. They imagine a small window at the top of the ark, but the Hebrew text indicates something much more significant. The word tsoha likely refers to an opening that circumdated the entire upper part of the ark, about 1 cubit high, approximately 45 centimeters, protected by a sloped cover that prevented direct rain from entering, but allowed air to pass. Imagine a clear story. Those elevated openings that medieval cathedrals use for ventilation and lighting. Hot air, loaded with ammonia and methane, naturally rises. By rising through the 3 floors of the ark, it would escape through this upper opening, creating a chimney effect that would pull fresh air in from below, through ventilation slits on the lower floors, or through the same hatches used for waste disposal. Without any mechanical fans, without any motor, just physics, thermal convection doing the work that no technology of the time could do. And this ventilation system solved not only the problem of toxic gases, but also temperature control. Because here is something rarely discussed. The ark was a thermally complex environment. Thousands of animal bodies generating metabolic heat, compost piles generating bacterial heat, all this inside a wooden structure with thick walls coated in bitumen, an excellent thermal insulator. Without ventilation, the internal temperature would rise to unbearable levels, especially for species adapted to cold climates. With the Tsoha ventilation and the chimney effect, air circulated constantly, dissipating excess heat and maintaining a more stable temperature on the middle floors, hotter on the lower floors, where the biological machinery of composting and insects was located, and cooler on the upper floors, where species more sensitive to heat could be housed. A natural thermal stratification. The same principle that makes the attic of your house hotter than the basement, only used intentionally as a climate zoning tool within a floating zoo. But you know what is fascinating? None of these systems, sloped floors, absorbent bedding, composting, convection ventilation, none of them are particularly sophisticated. None required knowledge that a civilization with centuries of agricultural and construction experience could not have had. Each individual solution is simple. What is extraordinary is the whole, the integration, the way each piece fits into the other to create something that functions like an organism. Food goes in, energy is extracted, waste is processed, byproducts are reused, and the system maintains its balance. This does not happen by accident. This requires design. And here each person will draw their own conclusion about who the designer was. Now, we have spent a lot of time talking about the animals, their food, their water, their waste. But there are 8 human beings inside this ark, and they also needed to eat every day for 370 days, and their diet was, surprise, probably the simplest part of this entire equation, because humans are the most adaptive animals on the planet when it comes to food. Noah and his family had access to everything the animals had: grains, legumes, dried fruits, sprouted shoots, and more. Bread, the most basic and oldest food of human civilization. Wheat or barley flour mixed with water, naturally fermented with environmental yeasts, baked on a hot surface. Sourdough, slow fermented bread, the kind of bread humanity ate for millennia before industrial yeast existed. And fermentation was crucial not only for flavor, but for nutrition. Raw grains contain phytic acid, which blocks the absorption of minerals like iron and zinc. Fermentation breaks down this phytic acid, releasing the nutrients. Fermented bread is significantly more nutritious than simple cooked grain. But wait, baking bread requires fire. And fire inside a wooden vessel coated with bitumen, an inflammable substance, sounds like suicide. It sounds like it, but it wasn't impossible. Ceramic ovens, the so-called tanur of the ancient Near East, were baked clay structures, completely insulated from the surrounding environment. The fire burned inside the oven. The smoke went out through a chimney directed toward the upper ventilation, and the heat remained contained within the ceramic chamber. Wooden ships throughout history have carried stoves and ovens on board. Roman galleys had kitchens, Viking ships prepared hot food, Chinese junks sailed with built-in ceramic stoves. The solution was always the same: insulate the heat source with non-flammable material and direct the smoke outside. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't as safe as a modern stove, but it was functional, and it allowed for something that went far beyond simply baking bread. It allowed for cooking legumes, lentils, chickpeas, beans, vegetable proteins that are almost indigestible when raw, but become the perfect dietary base when cooked. A ceramic pot with lentils, dried onions, dehydrated herbs, and salt, cooking slowly over a clay oven. It was a hot meal, substantial, comforting, and in an environment like the Ark, dark, noisy, claustrophobic, permeated by the inescapable smell of thousands of animals, a hot meal was not a luxury. It was psychological survival, because hunger was not the only enemy. There was another silent predator on board, one that does not appear in any species list, that takes up no space in compartments, that needs no food or water, but that could destroy the crew as efficiently as any storm. Despair. Monotony. The crushing weight of living the same day, every day, without knowing when it will end. Think about that for a second. You are locked inside a wooden structure with your family, 6 other people, and thousands of animals. Outside, the world you knew no longer exists. Every person you ever knew, besides the 7 by your side, is dead. Every city, every landscape, every place you have ever been, all submerged under miles of dark water, and you do not know when it ends. The biblical text tells us it was 370 days, but Noah did not know that on day 50, nor on day 100, nor on day 200. Every dawn was identical to the previous one, the same sway of the sea, the same noise, the same smell, the same tasks. The only variation was the intensity of the waves. Calm days where the ark barely moved. Stormy nights where everything shook, where the wood groaned under the pressure of the water, where the animals went into a collective panic and the noise became deafening. And in these conditions, food takes on a role that completely transcends nutrition. It becomes a ritual, an anchor. The shared meal, the 8 of them sitting together, eating hot bread and cooked lentils, perhaps with dried dates or figs for dessert, was probably the only moment of the day that felt human. The only break in the mechanical routine of keeping a floating zoo alive. It was the moment to talk, to remember, to perhaps imagine what would come after. What kind of world they would find when the waters receded. What kind of soil would wait for them. If the seeds they carried, because they certainly carried seeds to replant everything, would germinate in a land washed by an ocean of destruction. The meal was the only moment when they were not maintenance workers for an impossible ship. They were a family, And it is in this context that a nutritional detail becomes deeply relevant. The sprouted shoots, those that served to feed herbivores, also served the humans, and not just as a supplement, as medical prevention, because the most feared disease in long maritime voyages throughout the history of human navigation was scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, bleeding gums, teeth falling out, wounds that do not heal, internal hemorrhages, and eventually death. Scurvy killed more European sailors between the 15th and 18th centuries than storms, battles, and shipwrecks combined. The British Navy only discovered that lemon juice prevented scurvy at the end of the 18th century. But sprouted shoots contain vitamin C, significant amounts. A handful of barley or mung bean sprouts a day provides enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy completely. If Noah and his family consumed sprouts regularly, and it makes perfect sense that they did, since they were producing them for the animals anyway, then they had protection against the disease that devastated sailors millennia after them. A pre-diluvian civilization with 1,600 years of accumulated knowledge solved, almost certainly without knowing it, a problem that defeated the greatest navies of the modern world for centuries. But food had yet another function inside the ark, one that goes beyond the body and the mind. A spiritual function, because we cannot forget who Noah was, according to the biblical text. He was a man described as righteous and blameless in his generation, a man who walked with God. And in that tradition, nourishment is never just biological. The act of eating, of thanking for the food, of recognizing that every grain and every drop of water inside that ark was divine provision. This was part of the daily fabric of spiritual survival for the family. Every meal was an act of faith. Every morning when there was enough food was a confirmation of the promise. Because remember, God did not just command Noah to build the ark and board the animals. Genesis is specific. Take also every kind of food that is eaten and store it as provision for you and for the animals. The food provision was part of the commandment, and the daily fulfillment of that provision, the fact that the food did not run out, that the water did not dry up, that the systems worked for 370 days without collapsing, was, for that family, the living evidence that they were not alone in that vessel. But here we need to talk about something that no one mentions when telling this story. Time. Not the 370 days as an abstract number, the time lived. Because Noah's relationship with food inside the ark was not static. It changed, it evolved, it deteriorated. What the family ate on day 30 was not what they ate on day 200. And what they ate on day 200 was not what they ate on day 350. There was a hierarchy of depletion, an inevitable order in which food items ran out, one by one, transforming the diet on board into something increasingly restricted, increasingly monotonous, increasingly difficult to bear. The first to disappear were the fresh foods, fruits that had not been dried, vegetables that resisted for the first few weeks, but which, without refrigeration, without soil, without adequate sunlight, simply rotted. In the first few weeks, perhaps there was variety, perhaps there was flavor, but that window closed fast. Next came the dairy, if it existed on board. Aged cheeses last for months. Clarified butter, the ghee that Near Eastern civilizations already mastered, can last a year without refrigeration. But eventually, even these would run out. And then the hardcore remained. Survival foods, dry grains, dry legumes, dates, dried figs, honey, salt, olive oil, foods that last for years, but which, eaten every day without variation, without the slightest diversity, become a particular form of torture. Not hunger, not malnutrition, something more subtle and more corrosive. Food fatigue. Prisoners of war describe this. Astronauts on long missions describe this. Sailors on nuclear submarines who spend months submerged describe this. The body is fed, the stomach is full, but the mind rejects the food. The simple sight of another plate of lentils with bread, the same plate as yesterday, the day before, last week, last month, provokes something between nausea and anger. Food fatigue is not a whim. It is a real, documented psychological response that reduces caloric intake, compromises mood, and accelerates mental deterioration. And Noah had no way to solve this. There was no supermarket at the next port. There was no possible variation beyond what was already stored. The only thing he could do, and probably did, was vary the preparation. Cooked lentils one day, baked lentils with herbs the next, simple bread in the morning, bread with mashed dates at night, barley porridge with honey, toasted chickpeas with salt, minimal variations, almost insignificant. But in an environment where monotony was the most constant enemy, any difference, any new texture, any different combination of seasoning was an act of resistance against psychological collapse. It is curious how cooking in this context ceases to be a matter of pleasure and becomes a matter of emotional engineering. Whoever prepared the meals, probably the women of the family following the cultural patterns of the time, was not just cooking. They were keeping 8 human minds functioning. They were preventing despair from winning. And then, after months that felt like years, something changed. A morning like all the others, the same sway of the sea, the same creak of the wood, but suddenly a different sound, an impact, a tremor that ran through the entire structure, from the hull to the ceiling of the 3rd floor. The animals reacted, the people reacted. And then, silence. A kind of silence that no one inside that ark had heard in months. The swaying decreased. The ark tilted slightly to one side and stopped. Genesis 8:4. In the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. It ran aground. It touched bottom. After more than 150 days adrift in an ocean without a coast, without a reference, without a horizon that was not water, the ark finally found solid ground under its keel. But it wasn't over. This is the cruel detail that most people don't realize when they hear this story. The ark grounded on Ararat on day 150. The family only left on day 370. This means Noah was stuck inside the ark for another 220 days after knowing there was land beneath him. 7 months. 7 months watching the water level drop gradually, seeing mountain peaks emerge on the horizon, knowing that the world was reforming outside, and unable to leave. Unable to step on dry land, unable to breathe air that did not smell of animals. 7 additional months of waiting, now with the extra torture of hope. And during those 7 months, food continued to be consumed. The stocks continued to dwindle. Each passing day was one less day of provision. And no one knew when it would be safe to leave. Noah released a raven. The raven went back and forth, without finding a place to perch. Then he released a dove. The dove returned. There was not enough dry land. He waited 7 days. He released the dove again. This time she returned with something in her beak. An olive branch, green leaves, fresh, newly sprouted. Think of the impact of that moment for 8 people who had seen nothing green, nothing alive, nothing growing for almost a year. An olive leaf. Concrete, tangible proof that the world was being reborn. That somewhere down there, below the receding waters, the soil was alive enough to make an olive tree sprout. That the earth could produce food again. Noah waited 7 more days. He released the dove for the 3rd time. She did not return. She found a place to live. And then, finally, Genesis. Noah removed the covering from the ark and looked. The surface of the ground was dry. And what was the first thing Noah did upon leaving? It was not building a house. It was not exploring the terrain. It was not looking for fresh water or evaluating the soil for planting. The first thing Noah did, the very first action recorded after 370 days of confinement, was to build an altar and offer a sacrifice. Genesis. Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and all the clean birds, he offered burnt offerings on the altar. The first thing he did with food, with animals he had kept alive for more than a year, fed, cared for, protected, was to give them back to God. An act that, from a logistical point of view, seems absurd. You just spent an entire year ensuring the survival of every species, rationing every grain, controlling every drop of water, and the first thing you do is burn part of your stock on an altar. But it is exactly this apparent absurdity that reveals the priority. Before feeding himself, before rebuilding, before anything else, gratitude, recognition. The food came from somewhere, and that source deserved to be honored first. And then something happened that permanently changed humanity's relationship with food. Something that has reverberated through every civilization, every culture, every dinner table in human history since then. God spoke. Genesis 9:3. Everything that lives and moves will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. Did you hear that? Before the flood, the human diet prescribed in Genesis was vegetarian. Genesis, seeds and fruits, no meat. For 1,656 years of pre-Diluvian human history, according to biblical chronology, the original dietary mandate did not include animal meat. But now, after the flood, the permission was expanded. Everything that moves, meat, fish, poultry, and why? Why the change? Think about the post-flood world. The entire surface of the planet had been covered by salt water for months. The soil was devastated, salinized, saturated. There was no agriculture, no wheat fields, no olive or date orchards, only that solitary sprout the dove found. Replanting would take months, perhaps years, to produce enough harvest to sustain a family. And in the meantime, while the soil recovered, while the first seeds that Noah certainly brought on board germinated and grew slowly in a devastated land, they needed to eat. And the only abundant source of protein immediately available were the animals that had multiplied and the receding waters full of fish. The permission to eat meat was not a theological whim. It was a survival adaptation encoded as a commandment. God looking at a destroyed world and saying, what was sufficient before is not sufficient now. The rules have changed because reality has changed. Adapt. And that adaptability is perhaps the most profound lesson that Noah's Ark has to teach us about food. Not the logistical details, as fascinating as they are, not the calculations of tonnage or the ventilation systems or the composting cycles, but the human capacity to completely reconfigure its relationship with food when survival demands it. Think of the full arc. Before the flood, established agriculture, variety, abundance. During the flood, extreme rationing, monotony, processed and preserved foods, artificial germination, closed systems of nutrient recycling. After the flood, almost nothing, an absolute restart, new rules, new diet, a new relationship with nature. In 370 days, Noah and his family crossed the entire scale of human dietary experience, from civilization to confinement to the new beginning. And they survived every phase. And you know what is extraordinary? We repeat this pattern. All of human history, in a way, is a variation of what happened inside that ark. Consider, in 1898, during the Belgica expedition to Antarctica, a ship was trapped in the ice for more than a year. The crew survived on rationed provisions and seal meat, a diet no one would have chosen voluntarily, but which kept 19 men alive in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. Scurvy appeared. And it was fought with, guess what? Fresh, lightly cooked meat, which retained enough vitamin C to reverse the symptoms, the same disease that Noah's sprouts prevented. In 1914, Shackleton's endurance expedition faced an almost identical challenge. Ship destroyed by ice. 28 men surviving on penguin, seal, and dwindling provisions for months, until the impossible rescue Shackleton orchestrated in a lifeboat crossing the most dangerous ocean in the world. Food was the thread between life and death during the entire ordeal. In 1970, Apollo 13, a space disaster that almost killed 3 astronauts, reduced the entire question of survival to brutal numbers. How much water is left? How much energy is left? How long the life support system holds out? The astronauts rationed water to the point of dangerous dehydration. They lost weight. They were cold because turning off systems to save energy meant temperatures near freezing inside the capsule. They survived for 4 days, not 370, 4, and they still almost didn't make it. And today, as you watch this video, the International Space Station maintains a permanent crew in orbit, fed by a logistical system that involves regular launches of supply capsules, menus carefully planned by NASA nutritionists, freeze-dried, irradiated, vacuum-packed foods, 21st century technology, billions of dollars. And do you know what the biggest problem astronauts report after long missions is? Food fatigue, the monotony of eating the same meals repeatedly for months. The same problem Noah faced with a clay oven and a stock of lentils. It is almost comical. 4,000 years of technological advancement, rockets that travel at 28,000 kilometers per hour, computers that process trillions of operations per second, materials that resist the vacuum of space and the heat of atmospheric re-entry, and the fundamental problem, how to keep human beings fed, nourished, and psychologically stable in a confined environment for prolonged periods, remains essentially the same. The variables have not changed. Calories, nutrients, water, variety, morale. The same 5 variables that Noah managed with wood, ceramics, and dry grains, NASA manages with titanium, polymers, and freeze-dried food. The tools have evolved. The problem has not. And this brings us back to the question that opened this video more than an hour ago. What was the food like inside Noah's Ark? Now you know. It was toasted grain and cooked lentils and slow-fermented bread baked in a clay oven. It was dried figs, dates, honey, olive oil, and salt. It was barley sprouts germinated in damp wooden boxes, and chickpea porridge seasoned with herbs that lost their aroma as the months went by. It was simple food, repetitive, functional, calculated not to please but to keep alive humans and animals during a period that no one knew when would end. But it was more than that. It was engineering. It was logistics. It was intuitive biochemistry. Fermentation for nutrients, germination for vitamins, drying and salting for preservation. It was an integrated system where the waste of one animal became food for another, where dirty straw became compost, where the heat of the bodies was managed by passive ventilation, and where every grain consumed had been counted, stored, and protected months before the first drop of rain fell, and it was faith. Every meal served in that ark was a bet that tomorrow there would be another. Each rationed portion was a decision to trust that the system would hold for one more day. Each time Noah opened a bag of wheat and found dry, clean grain, without mold, without weevils, without deterioration, that was for him exactly what the biblical text says it was: provision. You can look at this story and see an impossible tale, or you can look at this story and see the most audacious survival project ever conceived. A project that required knowledge of zoology, botany, naval engineering, nutrition, waste management, climate control, and supply logistics, all integrated into a system that worked for 370 days without catastrophic failure. No spare parts, no external support, no second chance. 8 people, thousands of animals, a wooden box floating over the end of the world, and enough food for everyone. The question was never whether it is possible. Modern engineers have already demonstrated that the numbers add up. The question has always been, and remains, who planned it? Whether it was human genius accumulated over centuries, or whether it was something greater dictating the instructions to a righteous man in a corrupt generation, that answer each person carries with them. But one thing is undeniable. Someone did the math. And the math was right. If you made it this far, click on the video appearing on your screen now. I set it aside especially for those who watched this one to the end.